You have to understand something fundamental here, because most people misinterpret this moment completely. When an avoidant starts pulling away right when things begin to feel real, it's easy to assume disinterest, rejection, or even manipulation. But that assumption, while understandable, misses the deeper psychological truth. What you're actually witnessing is not a lack of feeling, it's the activation of fear. An avoidant doesn't fear casual interaction. Surface level connection is safe. It doesn't demand emotional exposure, it doesn't threaten their independence, and most importantly, it doesn't require them to rely on someone else. But the moment the connection begins to carry weight, when conversations become more meaningful, when emotional intimacy starts to build, when they sense that this could actually matter, that's when something shifts internally. Because now, it's no longer just about enjoying someone's presence. Now, it's about being seen. Now, it's about being known. And for someone with avoidant tendencies, that level of visibility feels dangerous. So what do? They create distance, not always dramatically. Sometimes it's subtle. They take longer to reply. They become less emotionally expressive. They start prioritizing other things. They might even convince themselves that something is off about you or the connection. But these behaviors are not random, they are protective strategies. They are ways of regulating an internal discomfort that feels overwhelming to them. And here's the paradox. The stronger the connection feels, the stronger the urge to pull away becomes. This is where many people get caught in a cycle of confusion, because from the outside, it looks contradictory. How can someone who is just opening up, just leaning in, suddenly become distant? The answer lies in understanding that for an avoidant, closeness and threat are often intertwined. The very thing they want connection is also the thing they've learned to associate with loss, rejection, or emotional overwhelm. So when reality starts to match that desire, fear steps in to interrupt it. Think about it this way. If someone has spent years, sometimes decades, building emotional independence as a form of protection, then deep connection isn't just unfamiliar, it challenges their entire sense of safety. It asks them to lower defenses that have, in their mind, kept them safe. And that's not something that happens comfortably or naturally. It creates tension. And people resolve tension in predictable ways. Some lean in, others pull back. Avoidants pull back. Now, this doesn't mean you ignore the behavior. It doesn't mean you excuse inconsistency or accept emotional unavailability. But it does mean you interpret it correctly. Because if you misread fear as indifference, you'll respond in a way that escalates the dynamic chasing, over-explaining, trying to prove your worth. And ironically, that response often reinforces their need to create even more distance. What's actually required here is a different level of awareness. You have to recognize that their withdrawal is not a signal that the connection meant nothing. In many cases, it's evidence that it meant something significant enough to trigger their defenses. And that realization changes how you move. You stop personalizing every shift. You stop reacting impulsively to every moment of distance. Instead, you begin to see the pattern for what it is. A fear response, not a truth, about your value. Because here's the deeper philosophical layer: people don't run from what is meaningless to them. They run from what has the power to affect them deeply. And for an avoidant, that level of emotional impact can feel like a loss of control, and loss of control feels like danger. So they retreat, not because they don't care, but because they don't yet know how to stay. And that brings you to a critical point of reflection. You have to ask yourself, are you responding to their behavior emotionally, or are you understanding it psychologically? Because the way you answer that question determines whether you get pulled into their cycle or rise above it. At the end of the day, this isn't just about them. It's about your ability to see clearly, to interpret behavior without losing your own center, and to respond from strength rather than reaction. Because when you understand that their distance is driven by fear, not absence of feeling, you stop chasing clarity from them and start creating clarity within yourself. And that's where your real power begins. Now, once you begin to understand that initial pullback, the next layer becomes even more confusing for most people, because it's not just distance you're dealing with, it's inconsistency. One moment they're present, engaged, even deeply connected to you. The next they feel like a completely different person, distant, distracted, emotionally unavailable. And if you don't understand the psychology behind this, it can destabilize you. But here's the truth. Mixed signals are not random behavior. They are a reflection of internal conflict. An avoidant is not operating from a place of clarity. They are operating from two competing drives that exist at the same time. On one side, there is a genuine desire for connection. They want intimacy. They want to feel understood. They want the comfort, the energy, the aliveness that comes from being close to someone who matters. That part of them is real. But on the other side, there is a deeply conditioned fear of what that connection represents. Because closeness to them is not just closeness. It carries associations, loss of independence, emotional exposure, the risk of being hurt, or even the fear of being consumed by someone else's expectations. So what you're seeing when they send mixed signals is not manipulation in the traditional sense. It's oscillation. It's the nervous system moving back and forth between approach and avoidance between this. Feels good, and this feels dangerous. And that creates a pattern. They lean in when they feel safe. They pull back when they feel overwhelmed. They show interest when their desire is leading. They withdraw when their fear takes over. And because these shifts happen internally, often without conscious awareness, the external behavior appears inconsistent and unpredictable. But to them, it feels like self-protection. Now here's where this becomes psychologically significant for you. Human beings are wired to seek patterns and stability. When someone is consistent, your mind relaxes. You know where you stand. But when someone is inconsistent, when their behavior keeps changing, you start searching for answers. You analyze, you question, you try to figure out what you did, right or wrong. And without realizing it, you become emotionally hooked into the uncertainty. Because inconsistency creates a loop. It pulls your attention inward. It makes you focus on them more, not less. You start waiting for the good version of them to come back because you've already experienced it. And that's what makes mixed signals so powerful. They give you just enough connection to stay invested, but not enough stability to feel secure. But again, you have to interpret this correctly. This is not a stable person expressing unstable interest. This is an internally divided person expressing both desire and fear at the same time. And if you respond to that inconsistency emotionally, if you chase the moments of connection, if you try to earn consistency through effort, you unintentionally reinforce the dynamic. Because now their push-pull behavior is being met with your increased investment, which removes the pressure for them to regulate their own patterns. Instead, what's required is awareness and restraint. You have to recognize that mixed signals are information. They are telling you something very specific. This person is not internally aligned. And when someone is not internally aligned, they cannot offer you external consistency no matter how strong the connection feels in certain moments. That doesn't make them bad. It makes them unprepared. And this is where your power comes in. Because you don't need to decode every shift in their behavior. You don't need to chase clarity from someone who is unclear within themselves. What you need is to anchor yourself in a standard understanding that consistency is not something you negotiate for, it's something you recognize. Because at a deeper level, mixed signals only have power over you if you abandon your need for clarity in exchange for emotional highs. So the question becomes, are you responding to who they are consistently, or are you reacting to who they are occasionally? Because those are two very different relationships. And once you see that clearly, something shifts. You stop being pulled into the emotional rhythm of their inconsistency, and you start observing it from a place of strength. You stop asking, why are they like this? And start asking, what am I willing to accept? Because ultimately, their mixed signals are not the problem. Your interpretation of them is. And when you stop confusing inconsistency with depth, you stop investing in confusion and start choosing clarity. As you begin to see the pattern in their inconsistency, the next layer reveals itself in how they handle emotional depth. Because it's one thing to be inconsistent in behavior, but it's another to consistently avoid meaningful emotional engagement. And this is where many people start to feel the real disconnect, even if they can't immediately explain it. You'll notice that whenever conversations begin to move beyond the surface, when they shift toward feelings, needs, expectations, or the future something changes. The energy tightens. The responses become shorter, more vague, or more intellectualized. Sometimes they deflect with humor. Sometimes they redirect the topic. And other times they simply shut down altogether. Now on the surface, it can feel dismissive. It can feel like they don't care enough to go deeper. But again, if you look at it psychologically, what you're seeing is not a lack of emotion, it's a resistance to experiencing emotion in a vulnerable, exposed way. Because deep emotional conversations require presence. They require honesty. They require someone to step out from behind their defenses and allow themselves to be seen without control. And for an avoidant, that level of exposure can feel overwhelming. It's important to understand that many avoidants are not disconnected from their feelings. In fact, they often feel deeply. But the difference is they've learned to manage those feelings internally rather than express them externally. They process alone. They regulate alone. They cope alone. And over time, this becomes their identity. I handle things myself. So when you invite them into a shared emotional space, it challenges that identity. It asks them to articulate things they're not used to verbalizing. It asks them to sit in emotions they're used to suppressing or bypassing. And most importantly, it asks them to trust that revealing those emotions won't lead to negative consequences. And if their past experiences have taught them that vulnerability leads to rejection, conflict, or loss of control, then their instinct will always be to avoid that territory altogether. So they stay on the surface not because they don't feel depth, but because depth feels unsafe. Now here's where this becomes critical for you. When someone avoids emotional conversations, it creates a gap. Not just in communication, but in connection. Because real intimacy is not built on shared activities or occasional affection, it's built on mutual understanding. It's built on the ability to say, this is what I feel, this is what I need, this is who I am, and to have that met with openness. Without that exchange, the relationship stays limited. It may feel good in moments, but it lacks foundation. And what most people do in response to this gap is they try to compensate. They try to initiate deeper conversations more frequently. They try to ask better questions, to create safer environments, to encourage openness. And while the intention is valid, the underlying assumption is often flawed. Because you cannot create emotional depth with someone who is actively avoiding it within themselves. That doesn't mean they'll never get there, but it does mean that your effort alone cannot bridge that gap. Emotional availability is not something you extract, it's something the other person has to develop internally. So again, the shift is not in trying harder. The shift is in seeing clearly. You begin to recognize that their avoidance of emotional conversations is not about your worth or the quality of your connection. It's about their capacity. It's about what they are currently able or unable to access within themselves. And once you see that, you stop personalizing the silence, the deflection, the lack of depth. You stop interpreting it as rejection, and you start recognizing it as limitation. And that recognition changes your position. Because instead of trying to pull them into deeper waters, you start asking whether they are willing and able to meet you there on their own. Because here's the reality. A relationship cannot grow beyond the level of emotional honesty that both people are willing to engage in. It will always plateau at the point where one person stops going deeper. So the question is no longer, how do I get them to open up? The question becomes, am I willing to stay in a dynamic where depth is consistently avoided? Because when you start asking that, you reclaim your agency. You stop chasing conversations that never fully happen. You stop investing in potential that isn't being realized. And you start aligning yourself with something more grounded, mutual, emotional presence. At the end of the day, love is not just about feeling something for someone. It's about being able to share that feeling openly, honestly, and consistently. And if someone cannot meet you in that space, then no matter how strong the connection feels in moments, it will never fully evolve into the kind of relationship that sustains itself. Because connection without emotional depth is not intimacy, it's proximity. And you have to decide if proximity is enough for you. Now, as you begin to recognize their discomfort with emotional depth, something even more paradoxical starts to appear, and this is where many people feel the most confused. Because it's not just that they avoid closeness. It's that right after moments of genuine intimacy, real connection, meaningful conversation, emotional openness, they pull away. And that feels contradictory. You share something real. They respond. There's presence. There's connection. There's even a sense of progress. For a brief moment, it feels like the relationship has shifted into something more grounded, more secure. And then almost immediately after, something changes. They become distant, less available, less expressive. As if the very moment that brought you closer somehow pushed them away. Now, if you interpret this emotionally, it feels like rejection. It feels like inconsistency. It can even feel like the connection wasn't real to begin with. But if you understand it psychologically, the pattern becomes much clearer. Because intimacy for an avoidant doesn't just create connection dash, it creates activation. That moment of closeness, as meaningful as it is, also triggers something deeper in their nervous system. It signals vulnerability. It signals exposure. And most importantly, it signals the possibility of dependency. And for someone who has learned consciously or unconsciously that dependency leads to pain, that signal is enough to create internal alarm. So what happens next is not a conscious decision. It's a regulation strategy. They pull back to regain emotional equilibrium. Think of it like this. Their system can tolerate closeness, but only up to a certain threshold. Once that threshold is crossed, once the interaction becomes too emotionally significant, they need space to bring themselves back to a state that feels safe and controlled. And that space often looks like distance, silence, or detachment. It's not that the intimacy was false. It's that it was too real. And that distinction matters. Because if you don't understand that, you'll start questioning the very moments that actually held the most truth. You'll begin to doubt the connection, to analyze what went wrong, to assume that something you said or did caused the shift. And in doing so, you lose sight of the pattern. The pattern is this. Closeness creates fear, and fear creates distance. Now here's where this becomes critical for you. When someone pulls away after intimacy, your instinct might be to reestablish that closeness as quickly as possible. To reach out, reassure, to bring things back to how they felt in that moment. But that response, while natural, often intensifies the cycle. Because now, as they are trying to create space to regulate, your movement toward them feels like pressure. And pressure, for an avoidant, amplifies the need to withdraw even further. So instead of breaking the pattern, it reinforces it. This is why awareness is so important. Because once you recognize that their withdrawal is not a reflection of the quality of the connection, but a reaction to the intensity of it, you stop responding impulsively. You stop trying to fix the distance immediately. And you start allowing space without abandoning your own sense of clarity. You begin to see that intimacy for them is not just something they experience, it's something they have to recover from. And that changes how you engage. It doesn't mean you accept a dynamic that leaves you feeling disconnected. It means you stop misinterpreting their behavior. You stop taking responsibility for a pattern that originates within them. And you start making more grounded decisions about what you need in return. Because here's the deeper truth. A healthy relationship doesn't just involve moments of closeness, it involves the ability to sustain that closeness without fear disrupting it. If every moment of intimacy is followed by distance, then the connection never stabilizes. It becomes cyclical. It rises, it falls, it resets. And over time, that cycle doesn't deepen. The relationship, it exhausts it. So the question you have to ask yourself is not whether the intimate moments are real. In many cases, they are. The question is whether those moments can be maintained, expanded, and integrated into something consistent. Because real connection is not just about touching depth, it's about staying there. And if someone can only meet you in intimacy temporarily, but cannot remain present in it, then what you have is not a stable bond. It's an intermittent experience. And you have to decide if that experience is enough. Because at some point, the most powerful shift you can make is this. You stop chasing moments and you start evaluating patterns. And when you do that, you no longer measure connection by how intense it feels in isolated instances. You measure it by how sustainable it is over time. Because intimacy that disappears is not intimacy you can build on, it's intimacy you have to keep recovering from. And real love doesn't require recovery. It requires consistency. As you begin to understand the cycles of distance, inconsistency, and emotional avoidance, another pattern becomes undeniable, and this one is more subtle, but just as revealing. Even when they care about you, even when they show affection, they still don't understand you. Even when there are moments that feel genuine and connected, there is still a part of them that remains inaccessible. It's as if you're standing at the edge of something deeper, but you're never fully allowed in. And that can be one of the most frustrating experiences because it creates a sense of almost understood, almost close, almost secure, but never completely. Now, most people interpret this as hesitation or uncertainty about the relationship itself. But again, when you look at it through a psychological lens, what you're seeing is not indecision, it's protection. Because letting someone fully in is not a small act. It requires a level of openness that goes beyond surface interaction. It means revealing fears, past wounds, insecurities, and truths that are not always comfortable to share. It means allowing another person to see not just the curated version of who you are, but the unfiltered reality. And for an avoidant, that level of exposure feels like risk. Not because they don't trust you specifically, but because they don't trust what vulnerability has meant in their past. Somewhere along the way, they learned that being fully known can lead to pain rejection, disappointment, loss of control, or emotional overwhelm. So instead of risking that experience again, they adapt. They compartmentalize. They show you parts of themselves, often the parts that feel safe, composed, or manageable, but they keep the deeper layers protected. And this isn't always a conscious decision. In many cases, it's automatic. It's a boundary that exists without them actively thinking about it. But you feel it. You feel it in the conversations that never quite reach depth. You feel it in the way certain topics are. Avoided or redirected. You feel it in the emotional distance that remains, even in moments of physical or surface level closeness. It's not that they're absent, it's that they're not fully present, and that distinction matters. Because a relationship can function on partial openness for a period of time. It can feel good, even meaningful. But over time, that lack of full access creates a ceiling. The connection stops growing. It stabilizes at a level that never quite becomes fulfilling. And this is where many people make a critical mistake. They start trying to earn access to those hidden parts. They believe that if they're patient enough, understanding enough, supportive enough, they'll eventually be let in completely. But emotional access is not something you earn through effort alone. It's something the other person has to be willing to give. And willingness is not just about intention, it's about capacity. It's about whether they have done the internal work required to feel safe, being seen at that level. Because without that internal shift, no amount of external reassurance will fully dissolve that boundary. So again, the shift for you is not in trying to break through that wall. It's in recognizing that the wall exists for a reason and asking yourself whether you're willing to stay outside of it. Because here's the deeper truth. You cannot build a fully realized connection with someone who is only partially available. No matter how strong the moments feel, no matter how much potential you see, the relationship will always be limited by what is withheld. And over time, that limitation doesn't just affect the relationship, it affects you. You begin to adjust. You lower expectations. You stop bringing up certain things. You become more cautious with your own vulnerability. And without realizing it, you start mirroring the very emotional restriction that you once felt confused by. And that's where the real cost shows up. Because now it's not just that they're holding back, it's that the relationship itself has become a space where full expression is no longer possible. So the question you have to ask yourself is not whether they care. In many cases, they do. The question is whether care without openness is enough to sustain the kind of connection you actually want. Because real intimacy is not built on partial truths. It's built on the willingness to be fully seen, even when that feels uncomfortable. And if someone cannot meet you in that space, then what you have is not a lack of potential, it's a limit of capacity. And recognizing that is not about giving up on them. It's about being honest with yourself. Because at the end of the day, love is not just about how much someone feels for you. It's about how much of themselves they are willing to share with you. And if they can only offer you pieces, then no matter how meaningful those pieces are, you will always feel the absence of the whole. And you have to decide whether you're willing to build a life around fragments or wait for something complete. And just when you think you've understood the rhythm, when you've made sense of the distance, the inconsistency, the emotional limit, something even more defining begins to happen. The moment the relationship starts to feel stable, they disrupt it. Now, this is where it becomes counterintuitive, because stability is what most people are working toward. Consistency, trust, a sense of emotional safety, these are the foundations of a healthy connection. So when those elements finally begin to take shape, you would expect things to deepen naturally. But with an avoidant, stability can feel just as threatening as vulnerability, because stability brings permanence into the picture. It implies continuity. It suggests that this connection is no longer temporary or optional, it's becoming real in a sustained way. And for someone who has built their identity around emotional independence and self-protection, that kind of permanence can trigger a different level of fear. Not the fear of the moment, but the fear of what the moment could turn into. So what do? They disrupt the very thing that was beginning to feel secure. Sometimes it shows up as picking unnecessary arguments. Small issues suddenly become significant. Tension appears where there was previously ease. Other times it's a shift in energy. They become distant, less engaged, less certain. They may even begin to question the relationship itself, not because something has fundamentally changed, but because the stability is forcing them to confront a level of commitment they don't feel prepared for. And in more subtle cases, it's self-sabotage. They withdraw just enough to destabilize the connection. They create uncertainty where there was clarity. They introduce doubt where there was trust. Now again, if you look at this emotionally, it feels confusing, even unfair. Why would someone disrupt something good? Why would they create problems when things are finally working? But if you look at it psychologically, the pattern becomes clear. For an avoidant, chaos is familiar. Distance is familiar. Uncertainty is familiar. These are states they've learned to navigate. But stability, real, grounded, consistent connection, that's unfamiliar territory. And what's unfamiliar often feels unsafe, even when it's objectively healthy. So instead of adapting to stability, they unconsciously recreate the dynamics that feel known. They return to distance. They return to unpredictability. They return to a state where they feel more in control, even if that control comes at the cost of connection. And this is where many people get pulled into a cycle that's difficult to break. Because when stability is disrupted, your instinct is to restore it, to fix what changed, to bring things back to how they were. And in doing so, you often take on more responsibility for the relationship than is actually yours to carry. You start managing the emotional balance. You start compensating for their withdrawal. You start trying to hold together something that they are unconsciously pulling apart. But here's the reality. You cannot create stability with someone who is not yet comfortable with it. Because stability is not just a condition of the relationship, it's a condition of the individual. It requires a level of internal security, a willingness to remain present even when things feel unfamiliar, and the capacity to tolerate consistency without interpreting it as a threat. And if someone doesn't have that, then no matter how good things become, they will find a way consciously or unconsciously to return to what feels safe to them. So again, the shift is not in trying to prevent the disruption. The shift is in recognizing what the disruption represents. It's not a sign that the connection lacks value. It's a sign that the connection has reached a level that challenges their current capacity. And that awareness changes how you respond. You stop trying to fix every disruption. You stop over-investing in restoring something that they are not yet able to maintain. And you start asking a different question. Can this person sustain the kind of relationship I'm trying to build? Because at the end of the day, it's not the intensity of the connection that determines its success, it's the stability of it. And if stability consistently triggers disruption, then what you have is not a foundation. It's a cycle. So the real decision is not whether the connection feels meaningful. The real decision is whether it can remain intact when it starts to feel secure. Because love is not tested in moments of chaos. It's revealed in moments of consistency. And if someone can only stay when things are uncertain but pulls away when things become stable, then they are not afraid of losing you, they are afraid of having you. And that is a fear no amount of effort on your part can resolve.